Welcome everyone to Kitsa's webinar series. My name is Ajay Nyamuthi. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Kitsa. Kitsa's mission is to make clinical trials accessible to everyone. As part of this mission, I've been constantly meeting clinical industry stakeholders who have dedicated themselves to make clinical trials more accessible. One of them is my good friend and CEO of Adaptive Research, Dr. Deepak Behra. Through Adaptive Research, Deepak is helping to integrate clinical trials into community practices. Welcome, Deepak.
Thank you, Ajay, for the introduction. Um, and I am, as Ajay mentioned, thanks. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Adaptive Research. Was trained as a physician, went into academic research for a number of years at Stanford, and then moved into the industry where I have been involved in drug development and commercialization. And as a part of this journey, a few years ago, started Adaptive Research, essentially noticing the difference or discrepancy that exists between where clinical trials are performed and where most patients go for their clinical care, and trying to bridge this discrepancy over time. Right. So with that, we will jump into the discussion. So today's we'll try to touch upon 5 key questions here. The questions are: how can clinical trials improve patient outcomes? And why don't your patients participate in clinical trials? We'll also touch upon how your practice, and it's not all altruistic, but how does your practice benefit from clinical trials? What are the barriers that might keep your practice from participating in trials? And understand very much that most community practices in the United States and elsewhere as well are a very busy practice. So how can you get started and how can you get going in trials? So just wanted to touch upon the fact that we'll be talking about sponsored clinical trials. Well, trials come in many different shapes and forms. I wanted to differentiate research from sponsored clinical trials, research from development. So research is something that we do, and most academic centers do, to find out and learn about novel ideas, novel concepts, novel mechanisms of action, and those kind of stuff. Whereas sponsored clinical trials hone in on a particular product or technology and develop it so that there is sufficient evidence available for its appropriate clinical use. And with that in mind, and sponsored clinical trials are taken up typically um, by pharma companies or device companies, and there is funding available for those trials. They are developed as a part of eventual commercialization. And there are 4 phases. If we are looking at drug trials specifically, there are 4 phases. The reason I brought this slide even up here is that the different phases have different levels of complexities and requirements, and some may fit community practice setting, and some others may not fit community practice settings. So you can pick and choose. You don't have to be doing all phases or all types of trials. You can figure out what best fits the setting that you practice in. Now, what are the goals of clinical trial participation? Of course, it's to advance medicine and science. It is to contribute to drug development and device development. But one thing that is often overlooked is that clinical trials give patients early access to therapies. Clinical trials can be an advanced care option for your patients. Now, I'll try to explain this by a couple of examples here. There was a study done, a cardiac study, which involved 500 hospitals. There were, as you can see in this graph, what this graph depicts is there was a group of hospitals where no patients were enrolled, and there was also a group of hospitals where a large number of patients were enrolled. Now, this study demonstrated that patients treated at hospitals most active in trial enrollment had greater than 30% lower mortality. And this goes beyond the patients that were enrolled in the study. Right? And similarly, there is a difference in cancer survival, okay, or mortality between urban and rural patients. So urban patients have lower mortality rates than rural patients. But when given uniform access to cancer care through clinical trials, rural and urban patients have similar outcomes. Now, these 2 examples over here demonstrate whether you look at it from a particular trial point of view or you look at it from a geographical point of view. Clinical trials have ripple effects, and they help not only the patient who is in the trial, they also help the facility or the practice itself, and also percolate even further out into the entire community around the facility that is doing clinical research here. Now, trials, however, we know the trials benefit those patients, but trials don't reach everyone. The patient's challenges are that, you know, more than 80% of patients likely to want to participate in clinical trials if their doctor recommends them, but less than 5% actually do. And why is that? There are several barriers that have been studied for clinical trial access. If you look at this graph, the biggest barrier to clinical trial access is no trial available, right? And I'm going to draw your attention to the last part where we're looking at patients enrolled. The white bar is the academic center enrollment, and the gray bar is the community center enrollment. You can see that the academic center enrollment in academic center is twice as frequent as in community centers, whereas majority of patients go for their care to community centers. So there is a large discrepancy between academic and community center enrollment. Now, switching gears, we know clinical trials benefit the patients and definitely benefit the sponsors that run those trials, but how do trials benefit your practice? Physicians want to be clinical trial investigators, but often do not know how to. Um, why would physicians want to do clinical trials? Of course, to give their patients the best and the latest care. They can contribute to future drugs and technologies and advanced medicine. There is intellectual stimulation in this process. So if you're feeling burnt out, doing something different from your daily routine could help with the burnout itself. There are opportunities for enhancing reputation and recognition, as well as increasing your revenues. Now, I wanted to touch upon the revenue potential of clinical trials. It's very important for community practices that are not grant funded or donation funded. So you have to have a revenue as a part of your daily routine. So traditional reimbursement is declining, and revenue source diversification can mitigate some of that effect by entering into clinical trials. There is less administrative burden in clinical trials than insurance claims, and the potential for yourself as a physician, personally, there is potential to grow into additional revenue streams, such as, excuse me, speaking engagements, advisory boards, and thought leadership. Right. Now, what are the barriers to participating in clinical trials for community centers? Physicians, only 15% of them are involved in clinical trials, and most of them in academic settings, whereas more than 80% would like to participate in clinical trials. But there are various challenges. First of all, they don't know what is clinical trial, how to do it, how to get started with clinical trials. There is a lot of documentation, as with everything else. The regulatory environment is something that we need to be familiar with. There is very specific finance and budgeting related to clinical trials. Research staff with sufficient expertise and proper expertise need to be in place. And finally, how do we get trials as a part of your overall business, right? And then how do we get started then? Well, uh, first of all, there's a mindset shift that needs to come in place because clinical trials, you view clinical trials as a project, not as your standard clinical practice. And why I wanted to make this differentiation is that in standard clinical practice, you often follow guidelines, but have the flexibility in clinical care. However, in clinical trials, you must strictly adhere to the protocol, study protocol. Every action, every decision that we make as a part of the clinical trial must align with the predetermined protocol as well as predetermined sort of objectives of the protocol. There's flexible scheduling in standard clinical practice, whereas very strict timelines and procedures to be followed. Each patient is its own project in a clinical trial. You have routine documentation, of course, in standard clinical practice, but the documentation in clinical trials, while repetitive and redundant in many ways, is extensive and required because we need to be able to follow the audit trail all the way through to its source. There are standard of care procedures that are done in standard clinical practice. There could be research specific procedures which are different and the performed the protocol of performing that particular procedure could be different from what you do a standard of care, and those have to be adhered to fairly strictly. You often, individual provider based is the practice is usually provider based. Uh, one single physician may be able to manage a patient. Sometimes a team of physicians manage a patient, but in this case, in clinical trials, there's team-based approach with very specified roles of the clinical research coordinators, of the program manager, of the research nurse, of the phlebotomist, of the budgeting and contracting team, and regulatory teams, and compliance officer, and everybody. Now, you might be thinking this sounds like a very significant change, and you're right, it is. But the good news is that many practices have done clinical trials and integrated clinical trials into their practice, and this is not difficult. It's achievable. You just have the right mindset shift, as well as go into it step by steps and start small. Begin with one or two very straightforward trials to get your feet wet, understand all the environment of clinical trials, leverage your existing skills, and much of what you do in standard practice translates into the clinical trials as well. You're already an expert in patient care, so you can get in there. Embrace teamwork. Your staff's diverse skills will shine in a clinical trial scenario as well. You just need to upskill them in terms of the how clinical research is performed, good clinical practices, and other regulatory and settings. Use your available resources, the tools and support systems, include other resources, for example, the technological advances that exist out there to sort of streamline your work and management. And remember the benefits, the enhanced structure, documentation practices, and everything, they actually improve offering to your patients. They improve your overall patient care. So that's a good thing for the practice, for patients, and for the community in general. Right. So, how do we prepare yourself for practice of clinical trials? And this is a not a set rule, but I feel this could be a very good guideline to go through. Assess your practice readiness, assess your capabilities, and make sure that you know what you can, what kind of patients you have, what kind of equipment you have in office, what you may need to, what kind of real estate you have. Is there an infusion room, an examination room, or something else that might be required? Again, just assess those. Not every trial requires everything, so you can pick and choose the trials that fit the capabilities and everything and the facilities that you have. There are certain essential steps. You need some required training and certifications. There are definitely staffing considerations. You need to have some research staff, or at least upskill your existing staff into research capabilities, add on research capabilities. There is, excuse me, administrative setup required, and a lot of compliance and regulatory requirements, which you can either keep in-house and learn within the practice staff, or you could outsource it to other groups that have the administrative setup and compliance and regulatory requirements. Understand those as well. If you need to buy equipment, invest in equipment, or what is your network? Map out your network. You may not be doing a study may require MRIs, study may require blood tests or lumbar punctures. Who within your network is capable of doing all of these different kind of services? So map out that network and gain their agreement into participating, or at least performing in those study required procedures. It is absolutely essential and useful to have a good technology infrastructure. Again, given how busy clinical practices can be, technology streamlines a lot of these things. Clinical trials are very strictly protocol driven, therefore it can be pre-mapped out, and you can, yeah, a lot of things can be handled by technology. It is which reduces the overall burden that your clinic might take on in a trial. Now, understand finally, there is no business without business development, right? So you'd have to figure out how to approach, which kind of trials to approach given your capabilities. Maybe start with something less onerous, even though they are less paying, and then get into something more detailed and deeper into the more complex that you can handle as you understand your capabilities and get used to operating in the trial space better and better. Right. Now, based on our experience, I can probably propose there is three models of community-based clinical trials. Um, However, I mean, these are not cut and dry. There are shades in between. There can be You can be creative in how you want to operate, and essentially what I'm trying to say is one size doesn't fit all, and there can be many ways of looking at it. Right. And the independent practice model does everything in-house. So you have the research staff, compliance teams, budget teams, technology, business development, as well as conduct the trial within your practice and everything. So you have high level of control, high level of, but this may also require significant investment in the beginning to start doing this. At the same time, you can also partner with a research center and have their team take care of a bunch of work. Definitely leverage their compliance and regulatory team and the budget and contracting team. Most research centers have their business development. While you retain your project staff and the research staff, you can invest in the technology and equipment, and of course, you'll be conducting the trial at your own practice alone. The third model is you affiliate yourself with a network where they have majority, and this is probably the best way to enter into clinical trials for a majority of practices. You conduct the trial at the practice itself, but you leverage and you share some research staff and some technology, which you borrow from the shared resources of the affiliated network. And the affiliated network really runs all the compliance, budget, contracting, and everything out there. So again, something that this could be the simplest or the lowest hurdle or barrier to entry into clinical trials, and I recommend considering this. So, and there are shades of various different kinds of arrangements in between these three models. The best practices for trial management in a busy practice in your regular clinical care, you really can't emphasize any more than integrating your trials into your daily workflow. Understand your practice, what your practice looks like, and understand how a trial would fit into your practice's routine itself. So nothing is disrupting, and your routine clinical practice is not disrupted. Neither is the trial impacted by that. So planning that out early on is helpful. Clinical trials are an advanced care option. So think of each patient that walks in, they can receive their usual clinical care, or they may qualify for a clinical trial as well. And leverage technology, again, very, very important. Understand what you can do with technology and how it can help you run your trial itself. There are patient recruitment tools. Kitsa is an excellent tool, for example, that is able to pre-identify and pre-screen your patients. So you have a great tool to match your patients that may qualify for a particular trial, so you can approach them. Use clinical trial management systems, use your EHR to flag patients and that may qualify for trials, and have trials offered as a part of your clinical practice. There is an effective communication is extremely important. Again, I can't emphasize any more on project-based teamwork. Certainly, regular team meetings, project management, understanding how things are progressing is useful. Having an extensive documentation, your clinical research coordinators and others would be expected to help you with this. Uh, if you can streamline the administrative tasks by using templates and automatic scheduling and other technological tools, that'll be great. It certainly expedites everything, and it takes a lot of burden off of your work. Quality control and continuous improvement, of course, again, dedicated research coordinators are important. Uh, Learn from your regular audits, learn from going back and checking how you're doing and tracking any deviations and improving it. Right? So, with that, I just wanted to again emphasize it's not very difficult to get into trials. You just need to know your way, uh, take small steps, and get started. There are some essential things that need to be done. Most of it is learning, and everything else pretty much can be started with what you already have as an infrastructure with very little investment upfront. I hope this was educational and useful. And if you have any other questions, want to chat separately or learn how to bring trials to your own practice, feel free to reach out to Ajay or myself. Thank you. And back to
Thank
Ajay.
you. Thank you, Deepak. There are a couple of audience questions that I've summarized. So let me ask some generic questions, in which overarching questions that will cover the questions that are raised by our audience. Um, you know, I've met practices which have done trial once or twice, made some investments, and then they burned their hands because they couldn't source more clinical trials. How do you address concerns of such community practices? Where does adaptive research play a role?
Yes, excellent question. So again, I think I go back to the three models that we looked at. It is useful to leverage existing resources elsewhere, so you do not go all in and put yourself in a position where you can be burnt. But at the same time, it is also a matter of choosing which kind of trials you are capable of doing, so you don't get burnt in terms of not being able to deliver and making revenue out of it. So pick the trials that are easy to perform and easy to deliver in the beginning while you're learning the processes as well. And finally, when you learn enough, you get to a point where you know which trials and how to leverage them to sort of bring further revenue into the practice itself. So your investment, both time-wise and money-wise, is well compensated or well recovered. And not only that, there is also another key aspect to it. Most clinics, as I mentioned, did not or do not really understand the trial budgeting piece of it. Clinical trials uh, can be budgeted differently than and should be budgeted differently than your clinical practice itself or clinical practice procedures. Just as an example, a physical examination in clinical practice is different from a physical examination in clinical trial from a finance point of view, although you do the exact same work. From a finance point of view, a physical exam in a clinical trial also requires documentation and ensures checking all the boxes, dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's, therefore can be budgeted much higher. And if you're not asking for that money, you're leaving money on the table. And therefore, you naturally feel burnt out because you now have to document that, but still get paid for the same thing as your insurance compensation. Just a simple example. There are more complexities to it than just this, but I hope that is helpful. So don't shy away from taking help. There are a lot of people who are knowledgeable about it. Just don't shy away from taking help.
So what are the typical steps involved in getting uh, some community practice started on clinical trials? So give a sense of timeline. How long, if a doctor says, yes, I want to be part of a clinical trial, what's a typical timeline that one can look at to get themselves started with a clinical trial?
Great question. Once again, it goes back to how deeply and how involved you want to be in trials at the outset. If you wanted to develop a complete dedicated research center, it's a different timeline that we're talking about. But majority of people that I have interacted with, they want to start small. All it requires of those physicians is really get trained in good clinical practices and research related, human subject safety and other things. Have some research staff that are trained in such and such as well. So depending on how quickly they get through these trainings, they can be research ready in as short as a week and or to a month, depending on how quickly they can go through the training part. That is all is really required. Everything else can be outsourced.
Fantastic. Deepak, thank you so much. I'm sure there'll be a lot of interest from community practices on how to participate in clinical trials. For the audience, feel free to reach out to either Deepak at your.partner@adaptiveresearch.com or to us at Kitsa, contact at kitsa.ai, and we're more than happy to make clinical trials accessible to everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ajay.